professor in Arabic and Islamic Studies here at Georgetown University. I'd like to welcome you all to our series where you get to meet scholars and hear them discuss their intellectual journeys. My guest today is Dr. Paula Sanders, professor at Rice University. You can find her full biography on this page. Dr. Sanders, welcome and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Omar. It's very nice to be here.
So I'd like to have us start by maybe hearing a little bit about yourself and what brought you to your specific areas of research. It would be great just to get to know you a little bit better.
Sure. I grew up in the Midwest. I'm from Kansas City, and people from Kansas City always think of themselves forever as being from Kansas City. I love my hometown. And I grew up in for the time, a kind of medium-sized Jewish community. And part of what really pushed me into the field of Islamic studies was a very substantial Hebrew school education. I started to study Hebrew from the time I was very young in a very serious way. I learned all of Hebrew grammar by the time I was about in 5th or 6th grade. It's not that my Hebrew is so great, but I knew the structures of the language. And I always had an interest in texts because of that. And as I grew older, I developed an interest in the Middle East, and as an undergraduate at Northwestern, started to take classes on Middle Eastern history and really discovered the medieval Islamic world, and it really captured my imagination. And so I started to study Arabic as an undergraduate, and Arabic came, I'm not going to say it was easy because I don't think there's anything easy about Arabic, but my knowledge of another Semitic language really helped me have a feel for Arabic. And I really loved the Arabic. I really loved studying the Arabic language. And so I decided I wanted to be a historian. I wanted disciplinary training in history. And I became more and more interested in the elements of the medieval Islamic world. So I decided that I would go off to graduate school, you know, in the way that people decide these things when they're 20 years old. And I decided to go to Princeton, partly because I wanted to be in a history department and not a Near Eastern Studies department, because my undergraduate advisor, Professor Carl Petrie, had said, get the disciplinary training in history. He said, you should go to a school that has a great history department and a great Near Eastern Studies department, but go to the history department. So I went to the history department at Princeton, and I did a lot of my work in Near Eastern Studies, but my PhD is actually in history, not in Near Eastern Studies. And when I went, I was primarily interested in the Eastern Islamic world, in Persia, in medieval Persia. And I started taking Persian as well as advanced Arabic. And then I went on CASA, the Center for Arabic Studies Abroad. I'm a Kasawiya. And I went to Cairo and I fell in love with Cairo. And when I came back to Princeton for my 3rd year of graduate school, I knew I wanted to do something on Egypt. I had switched from the Eastern Islamic world to, you know, Egypt and Syro-Palestine. And I got very interested in the Fatimids solely because they had founded the city of Cairo. And I loved Cairo. I still love Cairo. And probably people in the field know, you know, when you go to Cairo, nobody has a lukewarm reaction to Cairo. You either love it or you hate it. I love Cairo. And so I got very interested in the Fatimids because they had built Cairo. And for another reason, which was that at the time that I was a graduate student at Princeton in the late 1970s and early 1980s, cultural anthropology had just made its way into historical studies. Clifford Geertz was at the Institute. People were talking cultural anthropology. They were talking symbolic anthropology. I was taking courses in the history department where people were talking about those things. And so I decided that I would work on a topic that I thought was quite interesting, but that I didn't really know very much about, which was the urban ceremonial of the Fatimid dynasty. And I was also interested in, everybody else was working on Sunnis. I thought, I'll work on Shiis. That's kind of interesting. In those days, very few people were working on anything Shii. So, you always want to be a little bit different. So, so that is what brought me originally to my dissertation topic, which then some years later became my book, Ritual Politics in the City in Fatimid Cairo. And at the same time, I had also developed an interest in women's studies, because everybody, if you were female, everybody was interested in women's studies. It was very new. There hadn't been much going on in universities. And so I was part of a group of, history students at Princeton who were quite interested in women's studies, and was reading women's studies and early, and feminist theory of that generation. And I had been studying Islamic law. One of my fields in graduate school was classical Islamic law, and I had come across something in the Mukhtasar of al-Quduri about hermaphrodites. And I just thought it was quirky and interesting. But when I came back from Cairo, my advisor, Professor Avram Yudovich, said, if you want to work on this topic, I told him I'm really interested in this topic and it seems to have something to do with women's studies. And he put me in touch with Natalie Zeman Davis, who was teaching a course on the body in 16th century France. And he said, why don't you talk to Professor Davis and see if you can take her seminar? And in those days at Princeton, you took seminars wildly outside your field just because you wanted to sit and learn from people who were unbelievably smart and interesting. It's a little bit different today, where everybody focuses very tightly on reading for their exams. So I had a conversation with her. She was very welcoming to me. She said, yes, take the seminar. You'll do all of the reading on 15th and 16th century France, but you'll write your paper on this subject of hermaphrodites. So that was the origin of the article, Gendering the Ungendered Body. And that's how I got into that topic. And you can tell when you read that piece, which began as a paper in a seminar, a graduate seminar, then became Gendering the Ungendered Body, published in, I think it was sometime in the 1980s, maybe a little bit later, I don't quite remember, in the Ketty and Barron volume. And I think I would probably do it differently today, where there's more emphasis on where people are doing queer theory, where it's not so much women's studies or gender studies, but all different kinds of things. But I think that's a piece that has had a little bit of staying power and that a lot of people are interested in. But there's new work coming out on that in that area too, that I think people should really read carefully. So that was part of how I did that aspect of work. And I haven't really done a whole lot recently on women and gender in Islamic law. So the third aspect of the work that I have done has to do with Judeo-Islamics and the work on the Cairo Geniza. And that happened because I had the tremendous good fortune when I came back from Cairo of becoming research assistant to the late S.D. Goitein, who was really the master of the documentary Judeo-Arabic Geniza. And he needed a research assistant who could read Hebrew and also knew Arabic. And I fit the bill. And I was his research assistant for 4 years. And although I didn't do my dissertation on a Geniza topic, I became deeply enmeshed in Judeo-Arabic studies and had the tremendous honor of working almost every day with a very great scholar of an entirely different generation. They broke the mold after that. And so those have been, that's been the orbit. And I've moved in and out of Geniza studies at different times. I did the cumulative index for the 5 volumes of Mediterranean Society. And I teach courses on Jews and Christians in the Islamic world, and I follow the field very, very closely. But I hadn't really done a project that really was deeply enmeshed in the Geniza documents. And so I'll come back to that in just a second, because I am actually doing a project like that now. But in the meantime, I had gone back to Cairo to do what I imagined was going to be a follow-up to my book on Fatimid ceremonial, in which I was going to work on the Mamluks. And I was actually going to write what I really wanted to do was to write a comprehensive historiography of the Fatimid dynasty, because there are all kinds of complicated things. And one chapter of that was going to be on Fatimid monuments in medieval Cairo. And early on in my time at RC, at the American Research Center in Egypt, as I was waiting for my security clearances and my research permits to come in, I would sit in the library and talk to all of the people who were around, also waiting for their security clearances. And there was something else that I was supposed to be doing too. I was the NEH scholar in residence, and RC has the Egyptian Antiquities Project, and they had a lot of architectural conservators working on projects. And one of the things that I was supposed to do was to provide assistance to them, help them, direct them to sources, help them understand the context of medieval Islamic monuments. So I met a lot of architectural conservators. And I had a very, what I would call 19th century neo-romanticist idea about beautiful ruins and how marvelous they are. And then one day I was sitting in the library at RC and talking to a young architectural conservator named Ala al-Habashi, talking about how just beautiful these ruins are. It's just marvelous going out and wandering among the ruins, right? And he said, all of these monuments were reconstructed in the late 19th century by the Comité de Conservation des Monuments de l'Art Arabe. And I said, what do you mean? So I learned about the Comité. I learned about this massive 19th century effort to reconstruct these monuments. And suddenly I started asking myself an entirely different set of questions. It was a moment where the light bulb went on. I thought, why do I accept a monument as being authentic in a way that I would never accept a text so easily? Seeing is believing. So I started hanging out with architectural conservators and going to I would say, I'll carry your camera bag for you if you'll just let me come to the site with you. I'll take your notes for you. And what was originally going to be one chapter became this book, Creating Medieval Cairo, which talks about the political culture of creating a version of a medieval Islamic city in the late 19th century. So that's how I got to that project, which a fair number of people who are architectural conservators find a very, I would say, annoying book. And that also coincided with the point in my career where I think when you're mid-career, where you start asking yourself a lot more historiographical questions, and you start to question why you ask the questions you do. And so I really became very, very interested in the 19th century and the way the 19th century in particular has shaped the way many historians in the West think about many, many different periods of history. So that's been an ongoing interest of mine. So I finished that book, and then I went into administration for 10 years. So I was Dean of Graduate Studies and Vice Provost for Academic Affairs. And so I wasn't doing any big projects of my own. I was putting my time into teaching. And when I stepped down from that, I came back to a project that had interested me for a long time. Something that I had always wanted to do, which was to do a translation of the one volume of Al-Musabbahi's Akhbar Misr that remains. There's a very good edition of it. And it's very rich in detail about material culture. So this also coincided with a turn in the historical profession towards really thinking about material culture. And I had also wanted to do a project that would involve the integration of Arabic text, textual material, and Geniza documentary material, because so much of the vocabulary in those texts we can understand fully only by using the material from the Cairo Geniza. So I started working, in bits and pieces on that project, and have been working on it. And then decided that one of the things that we really need to do is also integrate the findings of archaeologists. And so most recently, I've turned my attention to ways of integrating Arabic textual material and documentary material, Judeo-Arabic material, and the archaeological material and methodologies. So I'm now trying to work on this project. I'm starting a small project in collaboration with an archaeologist who specializes in the Fatimid period. We're doing a little piece to see how we work together, and hoping that I can produce a translation with a long introduction that will take seriously and integrate the methodologies and data from archaeology with all of these other kinds of literary and documentary sources. That's my story.
Wow. I mean, fascinating. Thank you so much for giving us the backdrop to much of your work. I think it's really helpful just to know how it's developed and evolved over time. So thank you so much for taking us through your intellectual journey. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you very much. Great to meet you.
Thank you. Such a pleasure.